So I'm Conor Cahill. I'm here from Amazon Web Services Identity to talk to you about what we're doing with Federation. And before I get too far into my presentation, I have to give you some warnings up front. One warning is this is a Mac. I'm a long-term Windows person, so I will screw things up, and I'll be doing Windows operations when I'm trying to do a Mac operation. So if I have operator errors, I'm blaming it on the Mac. It's not me, it's the Mac. The other thing is I'm fairly new at Amazon, so I've been there for about 4 months, and when I try to think of the A term and think of what company I work for with an A, half the time it'll come out AOL, which was like 10 years ago, but somehow it comes out anyway. But if you hear me say AOL, I really meant Amazon. So anyway, I'm talking about Amazon. So what do we do with Federation in Amazon Web Services? I'm going to talk to you about two kinds of things we look at for Federation. One is where you're federating from your enterprise into your Amazon Web Services resources. So you're trying to get to your own stuff and manage your own stuff. The other scenario that I'll talk about is when you have an application that you want your customers to access some of your resources that you have within AWS. So we call that application identity federation. So I'll walk through those two cases and what different solutions we have for them. It's not one size fits all for everybody. There's many different situations. So this might be preaching to the choir in this audience, but why do federation? What's the value of doing federation? The main reason for doing federation is to leverage your existing identity pools. If you have a lot of users already inside your corporation, they already have passwords, you want to give them access to your resources, you don't have to create another user, you don't have to create more passwords, they get to get access. And the big advantage with the corporation too is, if they leave the company, when you take them out of your own identity store, they don't get access to AWS anymore, so you don't have to worry about cleaning up their accounts in multiple places. So in our federation use case from the enterprise, right, we're talking about going from the enterprise to AWS. Typically, it's done with either a lot of people will access AWS in the AWS console, so as a browser session. They also will access AWS through the APIs. And we even provide a command line tool which uses the APIs so that you can do a lot of things with shell scripts from your own clients and control the system. With application identity federation, it's mostly around mobile applications right now. We have toolkits that we provide for both Android and iOS so that you can magically incorporate this technology into your client with very easy, very out-of-the-box scenarios. And by the way, I like to get questions as I'm going through this. It will make it a lot more interesting. So if you do have a question, feel free to ask away. And I'll try to manage time. I may tell you to hold on for that question or whatever as we're going through it. So for federation from the enterprise, we have different levels of technology. Some that are clean out of the box that you don't have to do any work, and some you do some work with. In this case, role-based federation. It's where you're going to have your own authentication proxy in your service. This is not using a standard protocol like SAML or anything else. It's your own proxy. Your clients will go to your proxy. Your proxy will authenticate into AWS and get a session token that they give back to the customer and to your employee typically, and your employee will access the service. So we provide a model where you can assume a role. And this is some things that you spoke about earlier in Sean's presentation, where you can use it with third parties, where internally their services will call assume role, and then get access into our services. In that scenario, we go and you define a role, and you set what the role access policy is. This is what the role can do. In this case, the role is accessing an S3 bucket, or accessing S3, all the buckets. You then set a trust policy. This is who I trust to get into this role. So you have some external ID. This is what that party with this external ID is able to access this role. And then in the external party, you give them permission to call assume role. Right? And so you have those three pieces. And what happens is they call the STS, and this is very similar to, this is exactly the scenario, by the way, that Sean was describing before. You call into the STS, they get a temporary security token, and then you can use that temporary security token to turn around and access the services. Now with federation, so this is a more detailed scenario, I'm sorry, walking through the same use case. So this is where I'm going from a browser to get access to into a web service, again using role-based federation. So the browser goes up to the federation proxy. The federation proxy will be able to use their IAM credentials to access the STS. They'll authenticate the user, right? And so they'll do whatever your local authentication is in Windows Active Directory environment. That is most likely going to be a Kerberos authentication of the client. That's where the users are already on the domain. And then they will enumerate the groups within within the enterprise directory. And the reason why they enumerate the groups is we recommend that you match the groups that the user's in to roles that you've defined within your services, and you ask STS to list the roles. The federation proxy will get the roles, and then you match the roles to what groups the user's in within your directory, and you'll perhaps, if the user is in multiple roles that match, you give the user a combo box that says, hey, which one of these roles are you trying to assume? So if I can be an EC2 administrator and also be a S3 administrator, this might let me choose one role or the other when I'm going into it. When they figure out which role the user wants to assume, they will send an assume role request to the STS saying, I want to assume the role ABC. They'll get back a token for that role, and then they send that token down to the client and redirect the client over to the console with that token. And now the console will accept that token and give the user access into the console with the permissions that were specified in the assume role. It is possible, by the way, in that message 8, when you call the assume role, you can actually restrict the permissions even further than what the role has. So in the case where you know what the user's trying to do, you can lock down those permissions even tighter than what the original role had. It's useful in some cases when you have broad roles. You can make a fairly tight restriction there. And magically, the user will get access to the console. So the other model we have for federation is based on open standards, the SAML protocols. We support the Security Assertion Markup Language version 2.0, and the primary profile that we support with that is IDP-initiated single sign-on. We support out of the box a number of different single sign-on implementations, including Shibboleth, Ping, Active Directory Federation. In fact, I'll be demonstrating the ADFS scenarios very shortly. This can be used both for web single sign-on, so I can go single sign-on into the console and get access to the console, as well as I can use this to get I can use the SAML token to assume a role and use an API access into AWS. So it doesn't have to be through the console. It can be either side. So the scenario, if you look, these are the same players that were in the role-based federation that we looked at a second ago. And the scenario is you go up to the identity provider. The identity provider still authenticates the user within their domain. And then at this point, the identity provider has the information necessary to just simply redirect the user over to the AWS SAML endpoint and post the assertion over there. And then the AWS SAML endpoint validates the assertion, creates a temporary security credential that they send down to the client and redirects the client over to the browser. So this is how you get single sign-on. You come in through the SAML proxy, and you get direct access into the console. It works very magically. The user doesn't have to see anything in those steps. Although in some cases, if the user has multiple roles that they're in, they could get prompted as to which role they're trying to assume when they come into the console. So I do have a demo. This demonstration is based on ADFS, and I'll show you how I've set up ADFS and used it to get a single sign-on session into the AWS console. It's all magic. Interestingly, this shows how I put the demo together. I actually set up a couple of ADFS servers in my EC2 account. I'm sorry, in my AWS account under EC2. I've also set up a Workspaces account. Workspaces is one of the services we have where you can get essentially desktops in the sky. And so I'll access my EC2 instances and my ADFS to use that to single sign-on into my AWS console. So on to my demo. So first, let's look at the setup that I have. So first in ADFS, I've set up a SAML SP for AWS, and yes, it is responding. In the SAML SP, I've set I've actually gotten the metadata from AWS, brought it down to the client, and provided that metadata into Active Directory Federation services. So it's able to read that metadata and use that to set up the IP side of the federation. You can even click on this box for monitoring, and in the Active Directory Federation services will periodically read the metadata and keep the metadata up to date. So if we change our signing keys, if we change the endpoints where you're supposed to deliver assertions, this will keep it up to date automatically. So you don't have to go periodically go out yourself and update our metadata, or update your configuration from our metadata. On the server side, so let me go into, oh, that's not the one I want to go into. This is the one I want to go into. No, that is the one. I'm sorry, I'm getting it backwards. All right, so on the server side, you go into the identity access management and into identity providers. And here you can see I've set up an Active Directory demo. If I've changed my configuration on ADFS, I can save the metadata from ADFS and upload it into here. So I can replace the metadata. We don't pull the metadata from our server side. You have to if you've changed your configuration, you change your keys, you have to come out and update your metadata. The reason for that in many cases is we're running out in the big bad internet. You typically don't give public access to your Active Directory endpoints for us to go pull metadata out of your Active Directory, because it's probably not a good sign to expose your Active Directory to internet access. So that we've set it up so that you just have to update our metadata periodically. In addition, what I've done, and I've set up two roles. One, and they have particular names because we're going to do some name matching from the client. But there's Active Directory Federation Services, a dev for development, and a production user. And on my instance, I have set up a user. Go away, PowerShell. So I've set up a user, Bob Jones. And Bob is in, I've set up Bob to be in the AWS production group, right? And that's the group within ADFS. And I've configured ADFS to provide that role when I set up a single sign-on and Bob goes over to the AWS single sign-on portal. And so now when I log in as Bob on a workspace, so this is Bob, and notice if I try to get to the console as Bob, it asks me to log in, right? It asks me to provide my username and password. If I come in, I can go to the ADFS server. Now this is going to a generic page that will let me choose who I want to sign into. So I'm logged in as Bob. The ADFS server has authenticated me. I can choose to go into the AWS SAML SP, and I can sign in, and I will get access into the console. And notice up here, it shows what role I'm in and that I'm coming in as Bob. Now, let me log out of this. So we go back to where we were. The more normal situation is the user will save a link, and this link will actually also go to the ADFS server, and it will pass in the fact that Bob is trying to go to the AWS sign-on page, right? It actually passes in the name of the IDP that we're trying to get to, and so I'll automatically just go. So Bob doesn't even have to know or actively participate in the ADFS server. He clicks on a link in his browser, and he gets directly into the console and with the access. And you can see if I click on this link again, because I now have established a session, that I get access into the console. So I'm not faking it. This is all real stuff happening on real AWS servers that are running out in the wild right now. So that's SAML in a nutshell. There is a pretty detailed blog page available on the security blog for AWS that walks through all the steps necessary to configure ADFS. It's not anywhere near as simple as I made it seem when I just talked about it. You do have to go through a few steps to get all the pieces in the right place on the ADFS side and the pieces in the right place on our side. But once you go through those steps, everything's set up and it just works magically afterwards. So back to my presentation. Any questions so far? Yes? Yeah, so there's slight differences. For the API, you can ask for a token that you get back from your ADFS server and then use that to invoke the API. So you can do an assume role and get assume role with SAML, with a SAML assertion. So I go to ADFS and I say, give me a SAML assertion for AWS. And then I take that SAML assertion and I call the STS, instead of going to the single sign-on page, I call the STS and I say, hey, I want to assume the role ADFS production with this SAML token. And the STS will give me back a security token. I can then use a temporary session token that I can use to access the APIs, any of the AWS APIs that I'm authorized to access. Yeah, even in when you're on the console, all the transactions within AWS are always signed transactions with temporary tokens. So you always start with a long-term token, and that gets converted into short-term tokens that are used for your sessions. So they're actually every invocation of an AWS service is not only includes a token, but is a signed token. So it's not just a bearer token. It's a token that you have to prove with a signature. Yes?
How can AWS actually help in identifying conflicting rules to determine what are the conflicting rules we usually have?
I'm not sure. I don't. Can you?
Let's say I have created two roles in my system, and on one role I have given a permission that a user can only read an S3 instance, whereas for S3 service. And on a different role I have given that the user can write to S3 server. And those two roles have been given to the same user, which ideally should not happen. So how can, or do we have any capabilities or controls in AWS that can be?
So if you assign those permissions to individual users, if I assign two permissions to a user, like either through a group or directly to the user, and there's any deny will trump all. But if I say the user can assume a role X and the user can assume a role Y, and the roles have different permissions, because the user has to assume one or the other. They don't come into play at any one point in time. There is no way to tell. There's no resolution to that conflict. And there's actually, I'm not sure there should be, in that there are very valid reasons for me to have different roles that have totally different sets of permissions. And I say you're allowed to assume both of those, and you have to make a decision which one you want to assume. And in my CloudTrail log, I'll see exactly which roles you're assuming for doing your tasks, and I'll be able to tell whether you're doing the right job. But the fact that I've given you that permission to assume the role, AWS shouldn't restrict you from what you can assume or what you can give to somebody for assumption, in my opinion. So we don't have a way that, if the only manual way you could do it is if you put both permissions into, you took both sets of permissions you have in the different roles and put them into one and and then simulated what the effect would be. the one thing to be careful about, and the use of the word role when AWS talks about it, AWS Identity talks about it, is different than the traditional use of roles in role-based access control. What we call a group is much closer to the traditional thing of role-based access control, where in a group I can give a group of users a set of permissions. And if I put a user into two groups and there's conflicting permissions within the groups, the denial will trump, and the user will be, if one group says deny access to this bucket in S3, and the second group says give access to this bucket in S3, the user will be denied, because the deny trumps all. So groups is more what you would traditionally use for role-based access control. Roles are, in AWS speak, a role is a principle that someone can assume at a given point in time. It's one, you can only be one role. You can't have two roles. You can only have one at any given time, and a transaction can only appear underneath a single role. But a user can do a transaction that appears under multiple groups, and we will do the right resolution in that case. Yes? Yes. Correct. So we don't have right now in AWS an endpoint where you can go and say use my IDP to authenticate. That you come into AWS predefined with a SAML assertion. A lot of our enterprise cases, in my demo, I ran the Active Directory up in the cloud, and there are some of our customers do that, but a lot of our customers run their Active Directory in-house, and you tend to not have Active Directory endpoints available to the internet, and so it's not a traditional thing where you can reach from the internet, where AWS console sign-in pages, down into the enterprise to get authentication credentials. So we didn't see that as a high priority, and so that wasn't the first one we saw was the enterprise sending people out to us, and that's why we set that up. And that was, I think we shipped that last year. Is that correct, Sean? November of last year. So we're still in the early days. So yes. SAML 2.0 compliant IDPs. So any SAML 2.0. In fact, if I pull my presentation back up again, these are parties that are partner parties which we have worked with and tested with, and their implementations we know work. But it really is just a SAML. If we get a SAML assertion where you've registered the IDP in our infrastructure, it's a SAML 2.0 compliant. It's required to have certain attributes set within the assertion, which we document. But as long as you have those attributes set, then the assertion will be processed correctly.
If you're a vendor that would like to be another local on that list, is there a program, or is that
So Sean is the guy to talk to and for those who don't know, he's the guy who just gave the previous talk about delegation. So we're actively working to get other people involved in this. So on to the next use case, app identity federation. And one of the biggest reasons why we're pushing app identity federation is, we talk about having these security keys that people use to access our services. And what's happened with a lot of apps, the easy solution for someone when they're writing an application to access AWS, it says, oh, I need a key and a secret. I can just put that in my application, and I'll put that secret in my application, and then I will ship that to the public. And that key will be, the key which gets access to my AWS account will be inside my application. In some cases, it's inside a binary application, so you might say it's kind of hard to get to, but it's not. It's pretty easy to find. In other cases, people have taken that code and pushed it into GitHub, and then it's really easy to find because it's source code. And so we're really working with people to not include keys in their applications. That's one of the reasons why we do this. The other reason is, in a lot of cases, your application wants to work with consumers where you need the consumer to authenticate. right? You need some identity for the consumer, and you could create your own identity store, or you could allow the user to make use of their existing identities, whether they have a Facebook identity or an Amazon identity or a Gmail identity, and use that to get access into your services. So those are the two of the big reasons. The other reason is ease of development. We can show you in a demo I have that I'll show you in a little bit. In a few minutes, you can set your stuff up to accept Facebook and Amazon, and to synchronize data and to access AWS services on behalf of on your own AWS services on behalf of the user, so that, for example, you could store photos, or you could store game scores, or you could store book locations, whatever you want to store within AWS very easily and very securely, because you're not storing your own keys inside your application. And I'm going to talk through several stages of what we have supported and what still are valid, although the first two, they're not primary ones anymore. So the token vending machine, it's very similar to what I talked about with role-based federation. It's where you can vend your own tokens to get access into AWS services. And we even have an instance that you can roll out to pretty easily, EC2 instance, that will let you do this. It's mostly if you want to create your own identity pool. And it's very hard today for you to be successful forcing your customers to create new usernames and passwords. So it's not what we would consider the ideal solution. Last year, around this time, we rolled out Web Identity Federation. That's where we would accept Google, Amazon, or Facebook authenticated sessions for your client, so that you wouldn't have to include keys. It was just about identity, so how you could access and maintain data with different users. This year, about 2 weeks ago, we rolled out Amazon Cognito, and it comes from like incognito, but Amazon Cognito is like Web Identity Federation on steroids. So we don't even recommend talking about Web Identity Federation anymore. And Amazon Cognito is built on top of Web Identity Federation, so Web Identity Federation will continue to exist and is still there. But Cognito is the way moving forward, and it provides 3 different levels of service. One is it does identity federation. The second is it has a data synchronization service that works not only across providers, so it's not only whether the user is using Facebook or Google, but also across platforms, whether they're using an iOS device or an Android device or an Amazon Fire, whatever, any of those devices, you'll be able to synchronize data across those. And then it gives you secure access to your Amazon Web Services based on top of the user authentications. So the Cognito Identity it simplifies identity and access management. It lets you do per user account federation, so you can federate a given user to Facebook or federate a given user to Gmail, and even on a given user, say they have federated both Gmail and both Google and Facebook identities together. Then the user can use either one of those, and it's the same user and can synchronize the same data across different platforms. So you can treat that one, even though the user has used 2 different authentication credentials, you can treat them as one user within your infrastructure if you and the user have chosen to do that. It also supports a model called unauthenticated users. So it lets you give, and essentially an unauthenticated user is it's a platform identifier. So whatever device they're running it on, that gets a unique identifier when the user first accesses. And you can synchronize data to that platform and save that data on that platform. And then later, the user turns around and says, oh, I want to hook Facebook to it. Whatever data you've been synchronizing will stay with that user when they connect it to Facebook. And so the advantage there is you can let the user try things for a while. They don't have to connect to Facebook, or they don't have to connect an identity. They can just leave it there. And then later, they try it, they like it, they want to register it, they can register it, and whatever they've done up to that point, any data that you've saved on their behalf carries forward with them when they go in. And you don't have to do anything special in your app to take advantage of that. The second side of it is Cognito Sync. This is the real-time synchronization of data across platform. It doesn't matter which platform it's on, and you control when the synchronization takes place within your app. It's very simple. You set the data that you want to synchronize, and then you say, OK, synchronize it now, or nope, synchronize it then. You can synchronize it as often as you want. And then finally, Cognita Security. It's where you take that web identity that federation that you've done with the user. The user is authenticated in with a Facebook ID, and you now say, well, I want to invoke my S3 service on behalf of that user so I can store some photos that the user has taken underneath a slice of my account that only I can see, that only that user can see. And it makes it very easy to do that with temporary credentials. And underneath the hood, all the magic that's going on, calling the STS to get the right tokens and doing all that magic is done for you. So once you've hooked incognito and you've said, give me my federation, you can just turn around and invoke S3, and you'll be invoking S3 under the right setups. So more detail on Cognito identity. It's easy to integrate. I'll show you a demo, and it doesn't take a lot of work to do. It's a few lines of code to get it set up and hooked in. It does deal with unique users and across their devices. It's not just a particular device. It's, you can have a unique user across 5 different devices. The demo I'll show you, I'll have 2 different Android devices, and I'll be able to show that I can log in as a user on one and log in as the same user on the other and synchronize my data, and it shows up on both. The Cognito Sync is the service where you can synchronize data. You can store as much data as you want on behalf of the user and synchronize it. It's more meant, in this case, for small objects, name value pairs that aren't that big. It's not, if you're talking photos and large sets of data, large pieces of data, videos, photos, and that kind of stuff, we expect you to use something like S3, not sync. It doesn't make a lot of sense to try to synchronize 5,000 photos. Well, it can make sense to synchronize 5,000 photos, but not through this basic synchronization service. And it makes it very easy for you to get started. If you want to roll out a game where you're keeping track of the user's progress through multiple levels, you can hook in Cognito and roll it out in a matter of hours. And you can spend all your time concentrating on what you do good, which is differentiating your game, and not worry about all the stuff underneath the hood, how to build the infrastructure to manage the data and to maintain high availability and to maintain good backups and all that fun stuff. And finally, with Cognita Security, this is where you safeguard your credentials. You don't embed your credentials in the client, and you get access to whatever web services you want to give access to that client. So it's, again, you would define a role, and you would let that role will control what services that client could get into based on your setup with Cognito. And so simple steps to get this set up is you go into the Cognito page, and I'll show you where this is. You set up an identity pool. You then configure the identity access management, so you set up roles on what the members of that pool can do, and then you get a little set of code that you can embed into your application. So I don't think that's real code right there, but I don't think it'll work if you copy that down and use it, but the web page does give you code that you can actually use. So let's take a look at my demo and see if I can get it to work. So now I'm not a mobile developer, so this is always fun. I have 2 Android devices here. They're both very similar devices, and you can see they both have Cognito Sync. But before I actually show the devices, let's look at this guy. So, and by the way, when you notice here, I'm going to sign out of AWS. When I log into the console, this weird thing comes up, and then I get into my account. What actually happened there was AWS SAML Federation, right? We're federating into our own services, so we eat our own dog food. We use Federation within it. So how I get into my demo account is through Active Directory. It's not Active. I'm actually not sure what the implementation is, so it could possibly be Active Directory, but it is based off of my Active Directory authentication. I get into my AWS, my personal AWS account that I can use for playing in AWS. So we use it ourselves. So in Cognito, I can go in here and I have set up Notice it gives me a status of what people have been doing. I've only been playing with this for a couple of days, so I have 2 users that I've set up in here, some that have logged in with Facebook, some with Amazon, and I've done 25 syncs. Ooh, lots. But you could actually see, you know, if you're shipping this to thousands of customers, you could see how many times they're syncing data and saving data in your system, and that so that you have a good idea of how it's being used. I can edit my identity pool. So here I have my CIS demo. This is my pool ID. That's not magic. But notice I have a client ID for Amazon and a client ID for Facebook, and if I went and registered one, I could have a client ID for Google. This is how I hook into the federation services that those providers have, and I register my application with Amazon or with Facebook or Google, and they give me back a client ID and some secrets that my client can use to get a token and authenticate the user within their application. And I need to get those and set that up to configure my identity pool. And then I would define roles within IAM. Let's see if I have my roles here. So here I have set up a default role for authenticated use and unauthenticated use, so that this is where I can control. I can set explicit policies on what they're able to access. Right now in my policies, if I look at this, it just gives access to sync so that they can synchronize data, and also mobile analytics so they can put events. That's how that status, when I showed you the status when I first went in, it said how many times synchronization had taken place. That's some mobile analytics that are being registered. So that information is there in the role. And I could change that. I could give more, like if I decided I wanted this particular Cognito identity pool to access an S3 bucket. So I created, for example, a bucket where I wanted to be able to store pictures of the user. Or pictures that the user took. I could create a new bucket that's called photos. You know, I might call it Cognito Photos, and I could give permission in here for the application to access that, and the application would automatically be able to access that very simply after that. So looking at my demo, I have my sync set up. I have actually gone in before, and maybe it's going to wake up. Wake up. There we go. So here I can log in with Amazon. And by the way, the user I'm using is Bob Jones. Someone has created a Bob Jones CIS demo at gmail.com already. I don't know who, so that user ID was already used. So someone else was demonstrating a demo with Bob Jones for CIS at some point in the recent past. Anyway. Let me sign in as Amazon, as my Amazon ID. And now I should be able to magically go look at my data. And notice that my data is here. This actually pulled the data down because I had wiped this demo. And you can see my data is here. And you can tell I've been playing with it. CPC was here. I'm CPC, by the way, Conor Patrick Cahill, in case you're wondering. And now let's go into another phone. And I apologize, I was trying to get this stuff working with iOS too, so I could demonstrate iOS and Android on the same thing, but my mobile development skills are very, I can't even say rusty, they're like non-existent. And so last night wasn't able to get the iOS demo up and running. And I'm having trouble getting my Cognito run. Oh, there we go. So now on this one, I'll log in with Facebook. Now, in the past, in this particular account, I have, in my Cognito setup, I have logged in with Amazon and logged in with Facebook before. So they're both associated together, right, in Cognito. So when on this client, a new client that's been totally wiped, when I log in on here, it should find the same data. And notice Facebook says I've already authorized this. How do I get down to the bottom? Really?
You could press, you want to scroll it down, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so you press it and then move to the other thing.
Yeah, I think that this is, I'm running into a conflict between how you do things with Android and how you do things. I need a bigger screen. Or I should have picked a smaller phone to simulate. I know what I'll do for a second. I'll disconnect that. I'll get my OK. Maybe I'll get my OK. I see my OK, but it's not OK. It's not like doing anything. There we go. All right. Now we can go back to the little screen, little size window. All right, so now I can, no. There we go. So now we can see, I can see the data here. And if I go in and change this one and save it, of course, the button I want to press is down at the bottom again, so I'm going to have to disconnect for a second. I apologize. I didn't realize it was going to shrink so that I couldn't see my buttons. All right, I'm not getting it to work. So somehow I've broken my demos. They worked fine a few minutes ago, but they're really unhappy with me messing with my screen. So essentially, what you can do is you can, when you, the way it was supposed to work is I would hit, yeah, my demos really aren't cooperating. I would be able to enter data here and show you that it's synced to the other demo, even though one was logged in with Facebook and the second one was logged in with Amazon, because they're both synchronized together within the same infrastructure within AWS. So I apologize for having a demo that crapped out on me. And I'm positive that that's a user error in this case, because like I said, mobile development is still a very strange world for me. All right, back to my presentation. So, in summary, we have enterprise-level federation meant for getting access to AWS services. Hey, what's this we're hiring stuff going on here, Anders? Stop that. But we are hiring in case anybody's interested in a job. We do some pretty crazy and wild stuff, so come talk to us. Come talk to any of us that were here talking to you today. But for Enterprise Federation, very cool stuff where you can go from your enterprise out into AWS services and set it up so that your internal domain, whatever you're using as for your domain identity infrastructure, you can use that to access your AWS services without having to create any identities within AWS if you chose to do everything based on roles. And then for your applications, don't put your keys in your applications. Configure your applications to make use of Web Identity Federation, or Cognito, I should say, and you take advantage of the syncing services and all the other AWS services so that you can have a full-fledged application and give lots of features to your customers. So do we have any questions now on the second part, other than how to work with an Android demonstration? Yes? I would say the answer would be, it seems very obvious that will be a direction that we would go. I don't believe that we'll be locked into a single SSO protocol. So clearly, it's one of the ones that makes a lot of sense for us, especially when we want to do mobile apps, but even in the enterprise as well, I think. Yes? So, I mean, the demonstration was of your applications making use of AWS features, or even just making use of Cognito features. So we don't require you to do anything else within AWS to take advantage of Cognito. You don't have to use the sync services. You can just use Cognito, the identity federation services, without using anything else underneath the hood. Although you still need to, at some point, associate that with real data. So like what's happening underneath the hood when you use Cognito is your application is going to Facebook and saying, hey, give me an identity token for the user. And Facebook gives you back a token. And then you're asking us, again, underneath the hood, your application is asking us to interpret that identity in your context on your behalf to give access to your resources for that particular user. So we're treating it as your token because the token is targeted at your application, and we're processing it on your behalf. So you'd need somebody else. If you wanted to go into other services, you'd need them to be able to do the same kind of functionality. Yes? Okay. So if I can paraphrase, the question is, do I see whether there's use for a federation beyond just AWS into multiple cloud providers? And the answer, so I'm an old Liberty guy, right? So you can throw your darts or whatever you'd like to throw, but I think that federation is all about having identities cross boundaries, cross operational boundaries. And so that it's an ideal solution for when you want to interact with multiple environments. So yeah, I certainly see federation there. If you're asking, is AWS ready to ship a federation system that will grow cross boundaries? I think you need to look at the talk that's going to be on Tuesday. There's going to be a talk about AWS identity in the very interestingly titled session called the AAS Brothers. And I don't want to say that out loud because it will sound interesting. But PaaS and SaaS, there's a thread that goes on, I think, on Tuesday. And there'll be a talk about AWS identity and where we're going and what we're doing. So I think that will answer your question to some extent as well. So I can't take away from what they're presenting. Any other questions? Yes? I mean, to log into workspaces? That's a good question. I think workspaces is still pretty new, right? So I think they're still figuring out all the bells and whistles with it. So I don't know. I can't answer exactly where they'll be, but from what I've seen in my 4 months here, Amazon is all about what the customer wants. And it actually has been, I keep waiting for the shoe to drop because they actually still seem like they really are working for the customer. And so they give the feedback, provide that feedback, and you'll see things like that show up in features. Yes, you may. Yeah, but so that, at least the way I understand it today, and in my playing with workspaces, is I can connect it to my directory, but when I go from my machine into workspaces, I have to log in. And I believe your question was that step, can I start a workspaces up using a federation so I don't have to log in to start workspaces, is I believe what your question was at. Any other questions? So you guys ready to go out and write Cognito demos and SAML federation and all that fun stuff? All right. Well, thank you very much. Now I'll go play with my Android demo and see if I can get it to work.